Let's get started. Today we finish chapter 1, class view today. There are only a couple of things remaining to be discussed today. We finished last time this complicated elaboration on the issues of intended and unintended consequences when it comes to economic policies, economic system in general. Today we're going to say something about a few basic concepts related to economics, and very briefly, in a very rough and preliminary fashion. Something about the concept of exchange. A few things that will be the core of today's discussion, the macroeconomics. And finally, I will remind you eventually at the very end of something that we already talked about during the very first class, division between micro and macro. I'm not going to spend too much time on that because I already covered that. I'll just remind you very briefly of what is basically micro and macro. But the main thing for today is attempt to understand how economic analysis works and in which sense economics is similar and different to natural sciences. In which sense we can say that economics is a science, and is it a science in the same sense in which physics, chemistry, mathematics? We will see eventually that paradoxically, counterintuitively, economics is more similar in its method, mathematics, rather than the natural sciences. Okay, let's start first with the preliminary remarks about the concept of exchange. This is one of the things that is very often misunderstood. Economic behavior. Most notably, the basic question of why the exchange exists and why people do engage in exchange. And it is a long story about why this concept has been misunderstood historically. It begins with Aristotle. Actually, Aristotle was responsible in Greek philosophy of the 4th century BC. He was responsible for the formulation of the prevailing view of exchange that dominated until late 19th century. And this prevailing view was that the value of the things that are being exchanged had to be the same. If I exchange my pen for your wristwatch, that means that the pen is worth or valuable equally as the wristwatch. The implicit assumption of this theory was so equality of value. And it makes sense at a certain common sense level. If I give you something for something else, they might have been equal. But the implicit assumption, or let's say the precondition for this view, is that the value is something objective. That's what Aristotle believed. That's what economists believed, used to believe until late 19th century. Even when you read Adam Smith or David Ricardo or John Stuart Mill or Karl Marx, the most important economists of the 18th and 19th century, all of them subscribed to this. All of them believed that value, the exchange value, what we usually call the price of anything, is determined by a certain objective criteria. For example, labor theory of value means a laptop is worth 100 times a cup of coffee because it requires 100 times more labor hours to produce a laptop. So what determines the exchange value of a certain thing is the amount of labor necessary to produce that. The second kind of version of the same argument was the cost of production, which is essentially the same, just a slightly tweaked, just a slightly more sophisticated formulation. Actually, a laptop is worth 100 times more than a cup of coffee because the cost of producing a laptop, all costs of producing a laptop are 100 times greater than the cost of production. So here it's not only labor, but also all other materials that are used. But be that as it may, what all these theories have in common is actually that the value, the exchange value, is something that is subjective, given in advance. The price is a consequence of some objective reality that we can see, understand, measure, even can measure. And if that's the case, then of course, if the price of a laptop is $1,000 and the price of a cup of coffee is $10, maybe in 20 years, inflation increases. So then the exchange, what is the exchange ratio, relative prices of coffee versus laptops? It's 1 to 100. That's the objective ratio, objective relative price of coffee and laptops. So you need 100 cups of coffee for one. That was the prevailing theory. This is a false theory. And you can understand why is this a false theory when you start from the very basic question, why people make exchange? Why people do anything they do? Human action. What is human action? People deciding to apply a certain means to achieve certain ends. I'm thirsty, I'm reaching for a glass of water, I drink water, I satisfy my need. For water, I feel or I expect to be better off after that action. It's a conscious, deliberate activity to improve our subjectively felt sense of well-being. Any human action is like that. Any kind. So it is to be distinguished between human action, which is a conscious, deliberate activity at improving, aimed at improving our subjectively felt well-being, from unconscious behavior. You go see a doctor and he or she wants to check your reflexes. If he uses a hammer, hits you in the knee, and you make this movement flexibly. So that's not an action. So physiological reaction of our body, not actions. Okay, how do you apply that? So this applies to any kind of conscious deliberate activity. How about exchange? So we are making an exchange. Let's say that you have a wristwatch and I have a pen, and you want to exchange it for your wristwatch for my pen, and I want to exchange my pen for your wristwatch. And we do the exchange. I give you my pen for your wristwatch. Both of us feel better off after this act of exchange had taken place. The reason why an act of exchange had taken place is that I value the thing that you have more highly than the thing that I have. I want a new wristwatch. I want it more than I want my pen. And you want my pen more than you want the wristwatch. So you see that the precondition for an act of exchange is not the equality of value. Value is not objective. Value is subjective. Depends on whom. For me, a pen is less valuable than a wristwatch. For you, it's the other way around. The very reason why we make exchanges is actually that we value things differently. So the exchange is the key takeaway from this would be that the concept of exchange demonstrates one of the basic facts of economic science is the value is subjective. And the precondition for exchange is the inequality of subjective values. Equality of values. Different people value different things differently. And that's the reason why they engage in exchange. Inequality of values. Exchange is predicated upon inequality of values. If we both equally value a wristwatch and a pen, no exchange would have taken place. There's no reason. None of us would consider an exchange to be good for ourselves or a way to improve our subjective well-being. One more, let's say, implication of this. That exchange is a production technique. Exchange is a way to improve material wealth. Even without increasing the quantity and quality of consumer goods. That's very important. You remember that in the very first class we said that the final goal of economic activity is to maximize consumer satisfaction. Our sense of utility from consuming things that we consider to be valuable. So we say that society is wealthier insofar as the available supply of consumer goods is great. And how this is interpreted usually is to say that more consumer goods available for us, better off we are. But that's just the first part of the equation. We can be better off, we can improve our subjectively felt well-being, including material well-being, even without increasing production. Just by rearranging, just by matching people with objects that are out there in a better way than before. This example with the pen and wristwatches, everything that you need. The two of us exchange pen and a wristwatch. No new wristwatches have been produced, no new pens. But if two of us are society, or economic community, we're better off. Both of us are better satisfied with our subjective economic well-being after the exchange than before the exchange. Because her wristwatch was allocated to a wrong person. The person who values that object less. And also my pen was allocated to the wrong person. So then exchange is the shuffling around of goods. So this is a way to improve economic well-being as well, equally as producing new wristwatches, new pens. So that's just the basic phenomenological theory of exchange. The main point here is for you to understand that subjective utility or subjective evaluation is the key. Okay. Any questions thus far? Okay. Let's now move to Macroeconomics. Methodology. That's the theory about the method. And the method is the way how you go about doing something. So let's start from physics, natural sciences. What is the method that they use? How they study? Well, can someone describe some procedures that they use? Analyze the world. Makes sense. How the scientific process works. What scientists do and how they do it.
The scientific method, identify a problem, form a hypothesis.
Identify a problem and form a hypothesis. That's the first thing. What is a hypothesis?
If this happens, then if X happens, then Y happens. Y will happen.
Okay. If that happens, that this happens. Okay. What else?
I was just going to say it's like an educated guess.
Educated guess about how things are. So it's an educated guess. What's next? So there is a problem that you cannot understand, and now we propose a hypothesis. How is this problem to be understood? What is the next step?
Design and form an experiment.
Experiment. Okay, so there are now procedures for checking the hypothesis, so verifying. Is there any other method apart from the experiment?
Analyze data.
Yeah, analyze the data, but that's part of the procedure of checking the hypothesis, respecting all the methods.
Observation.
Observation. So what is the difference between observation and experiment?
So like no observation, you don't do anything to intervene. But
Yes. Observation, you just observe something that is happening independently. Astronomical observations. You don't influence the object of the observation in any shape or form. Just look for what's going on. What happens with an experiment? When you engage in an experiment?
You manipulate a variable.
Yeah, you manipulate the variables, you manipulate the elements of the situation in such a way as to make it more easy for you to check the influence of the relevant variables. So in the experiment, you control, at least to some degree, the environment. Control and manipulate the environment. And what is the final goal? Once you check the hypothesis, what will be the results?
Prove or disprove your hypothesis.
Yes, prove or disprove hypothesis. We call it usually it's a falsification. You say that the hypothesis is accepted as long as you are unable to falsify it. So that's a much more, that's the way how Karl Popper, philosopher, was responsible for this falsification theory of proof, scientific proof. it used to be that scientists believe actually that you can verify a hypothesis and then it's true once you verify it. But then they figured out that that's not a very useful way of looking at things, because what is verified right now, a new data can come along tomorrow, or a new experiment that may validate or falsify the hypothesis. So then a hypothesis is an accepted provisional scientific truth as long as it's not been falsified by the experiment or observation, or by the data, whatever the method of collecting the data, observation or experiment. If hypothesis is correct, typically in natural sciences you can use it to predict. Prediction is the key. That's how modern physics is applied for technology. We know exactly the laws of mechanics, Newtonian mechanics. We can predict if we create such and such a machine, it's going to move at such a speed. Forever. What is this? Force is proportional to mass and the acceleration. We use that to in the design of rockets, weapons. So the laws of physics that are verified, or that are hypotheses that are considered to be true, can be used then to devise technical implements, machines, devices, because you can predict what's going to happen. Modern electronics is based on something called quantum mechanics. Theory of the behavior of subatomic particles. So physicists are certain that subatomic particles, electrons, and photons behave in a certain way. They can use them to make machines because they can predict what's going to happen to such and such or electron behave in such a way. So prediction in science is possible and is based on the truthfulness of scientific hypotheses. That's a very brief and simple description of the scientific method. Of course, there are a variety of complications here that we are going to enter into. It's just the bare bones, simplest possible description. Try to apply this to economics, to social science. That's a, can you do the experiments? In economics. Oh, by the way, one more key assumption of the scientific method is the objectivity of your observation. Some very weird exceptions in quantum mechanics. Basic assumption is that by observing the object of your study, you are not influencing its behavior. Physical reality is independent from human mind and human procedures of observing and collecting the data. So the apparatus of registering the data is completely independent. It's uncorrelated to the data themselves. I drop a stone from a tower in Pisa and I calculate the gravitational acceleration. Stone falls irrespective of what I believe about Galileo, about Newton, whether it's a guy who doubts modern physics and so on. It will behave in the exact same way, irrespective of my own ideas, of my own expectations, of my own philosophy, or anything like that. So the data is objective. Objective and independent from human mind. Now, what is the data? Let me ask you that. What is the data in economics? Study supply, demand, prices, exchange, production. What is the data that you're interested in? What is the data that determines what is going to happen?
Like how much of a good is produced?
Yeah, that could be a piece of the data, but what causes goods to be produced? Why goods are produced? Why aluminum is now produced? Is there any physical any physical fact that determines how much aluminum is going to be produced? What determines how many chocolate cakes are going to be produced?
Well, how much of a need there is for that
Yeah.
thing?
How much you need? What determines how much of them will we need?
Preference. Preference.
Preferences, subjective ideas, preferences, and wishes of people. So this is your data. The contents of human mind is the data that you want to collect and to manipulate and to study. That's the data. Can I know what is the content? Can you know the content of my consciousness? Can I know the content of your consciousness? What is the method for observing your preferences? You can tell me what you think, but I may or may not believe you. You yourself may change your preferences sometime. So they're subjective and unstable. I like it. It seems to me that I like chocolate ice cream much more than vanilla ice cream right now, but tomorrow I might change for a variety of reasons. So now you're facing a problem here. Yes, you would like to form a hypothesis about human behavior, about what's going on in reality, and you need the data to check the hypothesis, but the data is something that is not accessible. What is accessible to you? Then only one thing. When a person does something that demonstrates the preference that that person has for something. You have chosen to come to class, you demonstrated your preference for being in this class to all other alternatives between 8 and 8 every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. That's the only thing that I can tell as an objective observer, scientist who want to study empirical human behavior. That's the only thing that I can know about you by looking at your behavior. You can tell me now all kinds of tales about yourself, but that's all subjective, irrelevant, subject to change, subject to deception and self-deception. So you see, whatever happens tomorrow in terms of producing what is going to be produced and how much, that's something objective that we can calculate. Is determined by what we think or believe or want today. So if that's the case, then how can you predict, for example, business cycle, whether an economy is going to enter into a recession or not? If the data that you need to make a prediction is in principle unknown. So prediction is very difficult in social sciences. One economist joke that predictions are very hard, especially if they're about the future. Sometimes predicting the past might be easier, but sometimes even that is meaning explaining the past. So now what can we do in economics? Are we left to our own devices? And anything goes, you cannot say anything about economics? Not so much. There is something that we can do. We can use the method of reasoning in mathematics and geometry. That is to say, we are going to assume that these things are correct. And we're going to derive a body of theory starting from these axioms, these claims that we take for granted. We consider them to be so obvious and so self-evidently true that you're not going to question. So axioms in mathematics and philosophy, those are the statements that we take for granted. We don't try to prove them. We cannot prove them, we take them simply for granted. So there are a variety of axioms that we accept in economics. One of them is that people prefer more to less. Or, all other things being equal, people would prefer the same economic good now than tomorrow. It's called the law of time preference. For sooner satisfaction or later satisfaction. So we cannot prove these in any meaningful sense, scientifically. We cannot satisfy a physicist or a chemist without proof of why people want to maximize utility. That's another axiom. It's self-evident. We want to be better off. We act to improve our position rather than to make it worse. So then we derive economic predictions. Not economic predictions, we derive certain theoretical statements about the world starting from these axioms. But the problem is that economic statements cannot predict what is going to happen. They're true only with this proviso having in mind. Ceteris paribus means all other things being equal. So let's say the law of demand is one of the economic laws. All other things being equal, higher price will lead to lower quantity of demand. You buy less if price is high. Now, why this law applies only all other things being equal? What can happen that this law might be used? If something is not equal, for example, a good, there's a better good. Price increases, but quality increases as well. So people will be ready to pay more for a higher quality laptop. So that changes actually. You will be looking at the empirical data. And you would see that the price of laptops increased. The law of demand says the quantity of laptops bought should go down. Higher the price, lower the quantity demanded. See, if the price is high, quantity demanded will be low. If price goes down, quantity demanded will go up. It's an inverse relationship between price and quantity. But if the reason why price increased is that the quality of the product increased, then maybe the quantity demanded may not go down. Because people will be buying now a different product, better product. Or another example. This is the one that I always like to use. So you have This is the supply curve, this is the demand curve, this is the price. So then you know that the market price is where supply and demand intersect. Whenever you, so this is an economic law. So it's a strict economic law. Every economist knows that this is true. All these stupid geeks, uneducated people don't know about the laws of supply and demand and market prices, the equilibrium between supply and demand. And what uneducated people also don't know, that if the price departs from the equilibrium value, if the price is lower than the equilibrium level, you will have then the situation like this. You will have a shortage. The quantity supplied will be smaller than the quantity supplied. Or if the price is artificially higher than the equilibrium level, then the quantity demanded will be smaller than the quantity supplied. This is then the surplus quantity. So let's say then that the government, now this is a good example to demonstrate why you cannot use economic principles to predict reality. Imagine that the government imposes something called price floor. That means that you cannot charge lower price than this one. That's a minimum wage. Let's say that on the market, the forces of supply and demand dictate a minimum wage $12 per hour. $12 per hour. And let's say that the government imposes $15 per hour minimum wage. You cannot pay anyone less than $15. What is the economic take on this? The economic take on this is that then you're going to create a surplus of labor. Because at a higher price of $15, more people would want to offer to supply labor services. Higher the price of something, higher the quantity supplied. More expensive something is, more people will want to sell more of that thing. In this particular case, minimum wage labor. Okay? Higher the price, people will be buying less of that thing. The law of demand. And then there will be a disconnect between supply and demand. There will be higher unemployment rate. Could you use that as a prediction? That whenever a government imposes a minimum wage law, that you will see an increase in employment in the statistical data, projected data. Can you say this is a prediction of what's going to happen if you increase minimum wage from the market level, market clearing equilibrium level to some higher level, you will see inevitably an increase in unemployment in the statistical data next 2, 3, 6 months. Can you say that? Why yes or why no? Is it necessary?
Maybe no, because you could get subsidized by the government.
Okay. You get subsidized by the government. What else can happen?
There's less jobs because it takes more to pay for the amount of jobs. Have, say, like you have a bunch of minimum wage jobs and your minimum wage gets raised, then you have less jobs if you have no more money coming in.
Okay, but you will have still effectively people who are unemployed, irrespective of how many minimum wage jobs. There will be other jobs. Imagine that the structure of the market remains the same. Jobs are there. What else can dampen the effect of minimum wage? What else can work in the opposite direction? Let's say that the government reduces taxes. Government reduces taxes, that will increase productivity, investment. Then maybe new people will be hired who wouldn't have been hired otherwise, that can offset the effect of the lost jobs in the minimum wage sector. Or regulations reduced. Anything that reduces the cost of doing business can offset the effects of wage hike. So you see that all kinds of things are happening at the same time. It's impossible to disentangle what causes what. So you can do an empirical study and say minimum wage has been increased 30%, unemployment remaining where it was before. Are you allowed to conclude that the minimum wage in this particular case in the state of North Dakota, that the laws of supply and demand do not apply anymore? Because you haven't seen empirically an increase in unemployment when you impose the price floor. No. The only thing that you can conclude is actually that probably some other things intervened to offset the effects of the price floor. So that's the trick. That the economic statements are necessarily true. So the laws of supply and demand are true. But the trick and the disappointing fact of life is that you cannot use them to predict what's going to happen tomorrow. Because you cannot isolate their own action or effects from the effects of other things that are going in the same time. Why can you cannot do that? Because you cannot experiment. What you do in the experiment, you actually manipulate the elements of the situation in such a way to isolate the causal action of one particular agent. In chemistry, it's a litmus test. Actually. You cannot make a litmus test in which you say, aha, this agent is responsible for this chemical reaction. It turns blue. 5 or 6 of other agents are not affecting this, only this one particular agent. In economics, human society is operating, all things are happening at the same time. You cannot disentangle what causes what social reality. If that's the case, then you cannot predict what is going to happen in reality if you change one element of the situation. You increase the minimum wage, sorry, but you cannot predict how exactly is that going to affect the unemployment rate. The only thing that you can predict is that all other things being equal, this will increase the unemployment. That unemployment will be higher than it would have otherwise been had you not involved in wage. But you cannot bet that the real unemployment rate will increase or decrease, because that depends on thousands of other things that are happening at the same time that you cannot control. The only conceivable way of you controlling this would be to freeze everything else. Right? The government cannot change anything. And nobody can change anything in what they do and why they do it. And the only thing that changes, that is allowed to change, is minimum wage. And then you, for certain, to predict that the unemployment rate. But of course, you cannot freeze society in such a way. Okay, so that's something that I wanted to tell you about, because in your book, I'm not very satisfied with how they cover this particular topic, because they seem to be vacillating between recognizing this significance of ceteris paribus reasoning, which kind of directly implies the impossibility to predict the future. You accept this, you forgo prediction as an element of your science. And nevertheless, they want to eat the cake and to have it at the same time. They say, yeah, economics is also about prediction. You want to have a hypothesis that can be checked and that can be used to predict the future. That doesn't work. That's one of the very, very common problems. This is something called physics envy. That economists have a certain complex that we are not scientific enough. That we want to be more like physicists and chemists. And if we cannot predict, if our statements cannot be strictly empirically checked, we feel bad about it. We feel that we are not scientific enough. So your textbook writers belong to a kind of milder sort of that economic mindset. So I gave you what I think is the truth. It's kind of God willing by our textbook. Both of the friend of mine will show up next year. They're going to be used for some classes. For macroeconomics, this is by far the best textbook that I found. But nevertheless, this one thing is something that I'm not very satisfied with. you recognize this thing here and still insist that economic statements should have some predictive power. And you say something is the case in economics that should allow you to predict what's going to happen. I wouldn't say that's impossible, categorically impossible. I don't want to overdo it, but it's very different. Very different. Okay, any final questions? So I decided I'm going to skip micro macro stuff. You have a few things mentioned about the division between micro and macro. I talked about that before, so I will leave it to you to read this. If you have any additional questions about that, we can discuss next class. The homework assignment for this weekend will be about that. So I think it's already open, but you will have until Sunday. Okay. See you. Have a nice weekend. See you all on Monday.